Hi YouTube, John here. So a short while ago I was asked to make a couple of slides briefly discussing how some of the Apollo astronauts collected samples on the lunar surface, and I sort of touched a bit about some of the tools they use and some of the activities they were doing on the lunar surface. And I thought all you lot on the Cosmic Cast channel might like to take a look. So without further ado, over to John.
So first off, just thought I'd take a few minutes just to introduce the Apollo program, the Apollo timeline. So in total, there were 6 missions spanning from 1969 all the way through to 1972. Each time, people successfully landed on the moon, explored a bit, and collected samples back to Earth. And each time, these missions got push the boundaries of lunar exploration. There were, in fact, a few more Apollo missions planned after Apollo 17, but unfortunately, public interest was starting to wane. Congress were less keen about funding this as it was quite expensive, and ultimately the Apollo program got cut short. And this is despite the fact that by the time we got to Apollo 17, we had excellent photography being taken and sent back, and even live TV coverage of the astronauts going about their business on the lunar surface. But unfortunately, it was not to be. But despite this, 12 people walked on the moon, and their pictures surround the video here right now. And they landed at a very broad selection of geographical locations. The circles on the face of the moon here and the corresponding numbers represent where each of the different Apollo missions landed. And each of these missions really pushed the boundaries of landing on the moon and some of the technical challenges associated with landing on another body. So the early Apollo missions, such as Apollo 11, focused mostly on landing on these mare basalts, these relatively flat volcanic plains. But by the time you got to Apollo 16 and Apollo 17, we had the technical capability of landing on more hummocky, undulating and rugged terrain, such as the lunar highlands. And so that enabled us to sample a much broader range of geologies from the lunar surface, which was really invaluable for understanding lunar science questions. But none of these astronauts were scientists, so they all underwent a crash course in field geology in places such as Iceland and Hawaii, and the Reese impact crater. And all these sorts of locations were what geologists at the time thought would be the best terrestrial analogues for what the surface of the moon might be like. And so this really gave them the sort of knowledge and the confidence to be out in the field, spotting what the interesting things are and what are the things worth reporting back to Houston and collecting. In fact, only one trained scientist has ever visited the moon, and this was Apollo 17 astronaut Jack Schmidt, pictured on the screen just now. And he wasn't just a scientist, he in fact had a PhD in geology, so he was the only geologist to actually walk on the moon and do field research on the moon, which is really cool. And in fact, he's still super active in the planetary science and in the lunar community today. He's still working on the samples that he collected, and he's still out there in conferences giving talks and doing the work. So that's absolutely awesome, really. He's a really cool guy. So I'm just going to talk now a bit about sort of the range of samples that were collected and how they were collected. The Apollo astronauts collected everything that ranged from soils to small chips and pebbles to larger hand-sized samples. And in fact, the picture that's just below me, just here, is the largest sample that was ever collected from the Apollo surface during Apollo 17, a whopping 11.7 kilograms. In addition to all of this, there were also a number of drill cores that attempted to sample stratigraphy into the lunar surface, but I'll talk a little bit more about some of those cores a bit later on. So, how do they go about collecting all this? Well, each astronaut on their right arm had a checklist, and that sort of gave them details about how to perform various activities, where they were, a small sketch map. And in addition to this, they had a team of geologists in their ear when they were in contact with mission control. There were a team of geologists that were advising the astronauts where to collect, what sort of interesting things might be worth going to look at as they were relaying information, as the astronauts were relaying information back to mission control. Geologists were then giving them information back about what they might be looking at. And so this two-way communication actually was really important in terms of getting the most out of doing field geology on the moon. Once they'd identified a sample they wanted to collect, this was then bagged up into a small bag. And in fact, 2 astronauts were needed to fully sample a rock. They would bag up the sample in this smaller bag, and then the other astronaut would then have to put it in a larger container that's on the astronaut's back, as circled by the red circle there. And of course, everything was really well characterized. They had these cameras mounted to the chest, so everything was being pictured and recorded, and they had various sort of color standards and charts and things for scale, and everything was really well characterized, documented, and pictured before and after collection. So in terms of actually sampling rock, they had tongs for picking up small rocks and loose material on the surface. They had this scoop-like thing for collecting soil, all the fine, unconsolidated dust and material that was on the lunar surface. And they also had some rakes. And these rakes, the tines of these rakes were 1 centimeter apart, and they would just drag it through the soil and collect up all the material that was trapped in the rake into a small net at the bottom of that rake. And of course, they had, like any good geologist, a trusty geological hammer. And this was used for hammering off rock chips, but also was used for hammering in these drive cores for sampling core samples into the lunar surface. So a bit more then about these sample cores. There were 2 types really. There were these so-called drive tubes that were able to sample the top tens of centimeters of the lunar surface. There's a double one shown from Apollo 14 on the left here. And these were hammered in by hand. And I think the maximum sampled through this method was up to 50 to 70 centimeters of the topmost lunar soil. But they were really difficult. They had to be hammered in by hand. And in depending on where they were on the moon and in terms of the geology, they took up to 50 strikes for some tubes to be hammered in. And sometimes when they reached a rock, a larger rock that got in the way of the tube, they just simply couldn't go any deeper. So this was really problematic. I guess one of our main limitations of humans being on the moon is, our physical strength. We can only really do so much, particularly in low gravity environments. So to get around this problem, they also introduced in Apollo 15 onwards the so-called deep drill cores, and these used a rotary percussion method of drilling down into the lunar surface, and they were able to sample much deeper into the lunar upmost lunar soil, up to 3 meters in the case of Apollo 17, which to this day holds the record of the deepest anyone's ever drilled on a planetary body outside of this Earth. So that's a neat record to hold, I think. And of course, supplementing all these activities from Apollo 50 onwards, they had the Lunar Rover. And these massively expanded the ability for astronauts to explore and to sample interesting things. On average, they were driven about 30 kilometers over the course of each Apollo mission. However, they were slightly fragile. In particular, the fenders had problems of snapping off during Apollo 16. A fender snapped and just kicked up a tremendous amount of dust, as you can see from the clip that's playing here just now. And to the extent that the crew, the console, and all the communication equipments and all the electronics were just covered in dust, to the point where it wasn't really usable, unfortunately. And so this was a major problem. They ended up just having to abandon the rover. And the same thing actually happened during Apollo 17. However, Gene Cernan and Jack Schmidt were able to do a quick fix where they took some of their maps and some spare clamps that they had in the landing module and managed to make a makeshift fender. And they were able to then continue with their using the rover without just getting covered in dust. And I think actually, this little story here is a fantastic example of why human exploration is so important. Because, our innate creativity to just be able to do quick fixes like this means that we can, resolve fairly simple problems and still be successful in whatever it is we're trying to achieve. If you think about the technical challenges associated with issuing commands to rovers that are at remote locations, you just wouldn't be able to do these kind of quick fixes. So, it's a great example of why humans actually are really important, a part of space exploration. And another benefit of human explorations is that humans are really good at seeing things. Now, this might sound a bit silly, but when compared to the limited camera equipment that some rovers have, our peripheral vision and our ability to spot interesting things means that potentially important samples and interesting samples don't get missed. And a particularly famous example of this is this rock here that you see on the lunar surface, the so-called seatbelt rock. During Apollo 15, in one of the rover expeditions, Commander Dave Scott, on his way back to the lunar module, spotted this interesting looking rock and just very quickly bagged it and continued on his journey. But importantly, he didn't tell mission control. He said he was just refastening his seatbelt. And we've got a short clip of the moment where he nipped out to get this rock just now.
Oh, there's some vesicular basalt right there, boy. Oh, man. Okay, let's just hold on 1 second. We gotta hit. Okay, we're stopping. Gotta get my seatbelt.
Roger, mark that you stop.
He's coming on. Man, why don't you hand me your seatbelt? Let's get off.
And so it turns out actually this was a really important sample. There's a better shot of this seatbelt rock here in the bottom left-hand corner, and it's what's known as a vesicular basalt. And what this means is that when this lava was erupted, it was full of gas, and these gas formed bubbles that were preserved in the lava. And they're quite common on Earth, but it turns out this is actually a very rare sample from what we've seen so far from the Apollo collection. There's not many samples like this that we have in the total lunar collection. And so, thanks to Dave Scott spotting something interesting, we have this actually really unique sample that tells us something really important about lunar volcanism that, a rover mission may have otherwise not been able to pick up on. Another great example of our ability to spot interesting things is the discovery of orange soil during Apollo 11 by Jack Schmidt. And I've got a clip just now of Jack Schmidt seeing this orange soil for the first time. Pictured here, as you can see, it's really orange compared to the monotonous grey background of the moon. And he was very excited to see something so different.
Oh, hey! Wait a minute. What? Where are the reflections? I've been through once. There is orange soil. Well, don't move it till I see it. It's all over. Orange. Don't move it till I see it. I've stirred it up with my feet. Hey, it is! I can see it from here. It's orange. Wait a minute, let me put my visor up. It's still orange. Sure it is.
So, what this glass turned out to be was volcanic glass, and this was material that was erupted from a volcano. This glassy material was then deposited onto the lunar surface. And a microscope image of this glass shards was shown here to show just quite how orange they are. But it's a really good example of how quickly plans can change, where we're 2 feet on the ground and in contact with mission control. They saw something interesting, and they formulated very rapidly a plan to sample some of this really important material. But of course, despite the fact that we can see stuff and we're very intuitive in how we sample things as humans, our physiology ultimately is one of the main limitations, particularly in sampling in low gravity. And in the clip that's just playing here, you can see that Jack Schmidt was having a lot of trouble sampling soils in the orange soil location. And you can see samples sort of flying all over the place. And, really this is a good example of where a rover perhaps would be better suited to more sort of well-defined sampling activities. It's precise mechanics and its mechanical parts, they're much better suited for this kind of work, particularly at low gravity. However, of course, rovers can't then go out and spot the interesting things that need to be collected.
Well, there we have it. So what do you all think? Should we be putting 2 feet back on the moon, exploring away, or should we be sticking to robotic exploration? I'd love to know what you think, and do comment down below. But in the meantime, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon.